And hello, everybody. You're very welcome to a new episode of Redefining CyberSecurity Podcast here on ITSP Magazine. I'm Sean Martin, your host. Most of you probably know that already. And you also likely know that I get to chat to some really cool folks about really important and fun topics. And one of those topics happens to be supply chain that comes up over and over and over again. I think I've recorded 3 on the topic this week, some connected to RSA conference, some beyond that. An important topic. I think we're all trying to figure out how we get our hands wrapped around this so we can deliver safe stuff, hardware and software. Today we're going to be talking about software supply chain and open source, and I have some cool folks with me today. We have Omkhar, Adrianne, Christopher, right? Yes, and Arun. See, the C Rob threw me off. I forgot the first name. Anyway, so I'm excited for this conversation, and I'm thrilled to have good representation. It's probably one of the more fuller podcasts in terms of guests that I've had in a while. So I'm excited for this. We'll see where this goes. I'm going to get a few words from each of you to tell us who you are, what you're up to, and your role within OpenSSF. Adrianne, we'll start with you, please.
Yeah. I am Adrianne Marcum. I am the technical project manager for OpenSSF. I joined back in July of last year, so about 9 months at this point. It's been really neat to learn more about open source security and just working with our community. I get to work a lot with the technical initiatives, kind of helping them through their process with their roadmaps and getting things done. It's a great community. I really enjoy them.
Fantastic. Thanks for being here. Omkhar.
Hi, I'm Omkhar Arasaratnam. I'm the general manager of the OpenSSF. Sean, thank you for having us on. And I provide day-to-day direction to the staff working on OpenSSF. I also liaise with our community as well as our board members.
Fantastic. Christopher.
Hey, everybody. I am Christopher Robinson, a.k.a. Krobe. I do security stuff on the internet. In regards to the OpenSSF in particular, I am the current chairperson of the Technical Advisory Council. I also am a chairperson for a couple of our technical initiatives, and I'm a sponsor for a whole set of other technical initiatives. So I help kind of guide them through things. So in our world here, I spend most of our time working with open source maintainers, security researchers, people involved in upstream open source security.
You have your hands full there, Christopher.
Right.
And Arun.
Yeah, thank you for having us here. My name is Arun. I work at Vice President and General Manager of Open Ecosystem Team at Intel. I'm also blessed to be the Governing Board Chair for OpenSSF. So I work with all the Governing Board members and all the wonderful people over here to really take the mission of OpenSSF further.
And that's a great segue, Arun, that Omkhar gets to take us on a journey with. I want to know, let's set the stage with what is OpenSSF, and we'll get into all the activities and deliverables and outcomes that you guys do. What's the vision, mission? What's it all about, Omkhar?
Sure, I'll get us started, but obviously invite all of our colleagues here to jump in. The first rule about OpenSSF is you don't talk about it. No, I'm joking.
One of those, I see.
Yeah, OpenSSF has the lofty goal, and there was an acronym that Arun used earlier, and I forget it. I'll ask him to enumerate it later, but we have the audacious goal of trying to secure open source software, full stop. Open source software, although it has this almost legendary status in terms of all the neat things it's done over the years, people aren't always aware of all the places open source software exists today. By our estimate, in something like 90%, over 90% of commercial software contains some kind of open source software. So us securing open source software is an incredible mission and also very important for everybody. It's a public good, and it's our mission to secure open source software for everyone.
So who wants to peel back the onion on that stat? who can paint the picture on where open source is in 90% of the stuff we use? Because I can obviously picture software, applications, commercial stuff getting forked, used in bespoke applications, but I presume it's also running in cars and other places, right? So who can paint that picture for us? Where
Well,
stuff?
Crobe is the right guy for painting that technical picture. But just to kind of go back to what Omkar was saying, the acronym he was talking about is BHAG, BHAG, and so it's an Intel acronym, and that I shared this morning with him. And the whole idea here is it's a big, hairy, audacious goal. It's like we want to make the open source secure. What does that mean? Like, it's used anywhere and everywhere, whether you're using a car, whether you're using a phone, if you have sent an email, if you have watched an Instagram reel, 90% of that software stack, all the way from Linux to JDK to Kubernetes to PyTorch to running your LLMs, there is some open source element involved in there. And, open source is good, but it has to be secure, and security is not the top job until it becomes the top job right away. I think that's super important to keep that open source software secure. Our digital infrastructure across the country, talk about transport, talk about, planes, talk about trains, talk about buses, talk about schools. They rely so significantly and heavily on open source that ensuring security of that open source so that the threats and all, the vulnerabilities all can be minimized is exactly what the charter is, the big, hairy, audacious goal. And that's where people like Crobe and Adrian fit in. That how do we take that BHAG and kind of break it down into a mindful, manageable pieces and start making a really impactful way, yet setting up a long-term goal that in 4 years, 5 years, this is where we want to get to. And I will hand it over to Crobe.
Yeah, and when you think about open source software, it is literally everywhere. You'll have college and high school students working on software projects that they'll push out to the internet. You'll have professional software developers that work at companies like Intel or Google or Yahoo or any of these large, big tech companies. Every government on the planet uses it. Every military, every financial institution, most manufacturers. It runs critical infrastructure. It runs things like the Mars rover and the Little Mars helicopter and satellites and telescopes. It's in everything. It's in your cars. There's a big movement for embedded Linux, and that's automotive industries really embrace that. But it's also in medical devices. So if you have an MRI or you're having a radiology scan, that's all run based at its core with Linux and open source technology. So it's in every smartphone, most gaming consoles. All these things are built upon the amazing world of open source software.
Yeah, International Space Station. I'm sure something.
One of the really interesting aspects that we get involved in is there's really three primary stakeholders, right? It's the private companies. It is the public sector as well, because there's a significant amount of public sector involvement in using open source because it's a public good, as well as the community. And Adrian, I'm going to put you on the spot here. I think you've been doing some excellent work with the task forces, which is a body of work that we started off, I guess it was last September, when we convened a meeting between our members and very senior executives in the U.S. government, and kicked off a bunch of work. Adrian, did you want to cover some of those task forces and the great accomplishments we've had thus far?
Yeah, absolutely. So from our initial meeting back in DC in September, there's basically three main focuses that we decided to really focus on moving forward. Securing open source repositories, because that's where everything is, and that's where attacks are obvious to happen. We also focused on getting better incident response across industry, getting public and private sector working together to kind of share what they see happening around the ecosystems, and also in improving education. And again, going to that point of not just the consumers, not just the maintainers, everybody, from the maintainers all the way downstream to make sure that, as you see a project, this is great, I want to incorporate it in mine, making sure you know as much as you can about the best practices that project is or isn't using, so you can have an informed decision-making process. For each of those, lots of different initiatives that have happened. We've got a couple of standards that have been set for the securing of software repos, one from the package repository side, and then also trying to get, everybody loves SBOMs, but what is an SBOM? Like, even if you know what an SBOM is, you there's so much variation on what it can be, and so trying to get some standards in place on that so that we can really identify some standard tooling so that we're all kind of aiming for the same target and getting those. You want to kind of focus on this, what the end users actually need and actually use, and then the rest is all extra. Can I keep going on about what we've done? I feel like I've been just blabbing.
I'm just happy you only said SBOM twice. That means Alan isn't going to show up.
I know. The third time, and he'll be wearing his shirt, I'm sure.
Yeah, no worries. I'm already switching to the next one. With incident response, OpenSSF had their first tabletop exercise at the SOS Community Day back in Seattle, which was a big success. And we're getting the feedback now, and we'll be sharing out the playbook that happened there. Also, we helped sponsor and help work with the first PhoneCon that happened, which Crow can go into far greater detail than I can. One thing I was really excited about with that PhoneCon, aside from there being I think 11 or something presenters from OpenSSF, was also that the focus wasn't on any of the individual systems for reporting vulnerabilities, but how to get them all working together. And so it's really that thing of again, you have so many different tools. Are we all saying the same thing? Are we all hearing the same thing? And what can we do? What actions can we take moving forward? And then on the education piece, so much always happening with education. I feel like that's just a big part of what OpenSSF is as a foundation. We've released a state of education report that kind of shows the gaps that have been identified. We had a survey running for, it felt like every week for months. David Wheeler was like, look at this survey. I think that's finally been wrapped up, and we got a good number. I think it was approaching 400 really good responses, which is fantastic. So that's going to be all aggregated so that we can put that into the work that we're doing with our actual coursework. We've been adding labs to the introductory coursework, and then also expanding that to higher level courses, incorporating the feedback that we get from that survey, and then also targeting training toward managers so they understand the importance too. Because if you're not hands on keyboard, if you're, I've worked in companies where hey, we've got this vulnerability, and they're like, whatever, it's not on the roadmap. But really, if you get the people who make the decisions on board with getting this training, it's going to get a lot more traction than just the folks on the ground who don't always get that big say. So I feel like I've covered most of it. I don't know if there's anything else to add. Thanks for listening.
I'll add that we started off engaging with U.S. Government, public policy, and industry folks, but through a lot of Omkhar's work, we've also started to engage folks in the EU. I think we have an EU SOS summit coming up, and then we also are in talks with folks in APAC as well. So it's a global concern.
On the EU side, which will actually be the week after RSA, we're convening in similar concert a bunch of our members, a bunch of public sector. The EU is currently going through activity around the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, and setting security standards. And we want to be there to support them. In Europe, they tend to set legislation first, ahead of technology. US takes a different perspective. We're software engineers, not legislators. We're just there to ensure technical correctness and make sure that the right outcome is achieved for the community. So we're going to be doing that. And I believe that same week, and sorry, my travel schedule is a little ridiculous. So I'm going to be heading to Japan to meet with the Japanese government on a similar set of topics. But I think in conclusion, while we did begin, as Crow mentioned, with the US, this is an interest globally. And in fact, Arun, I might get you to mention some of the incredible work that you've been doing with the UN as well, and their perspective on open source.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think as Omkar talked about, there are three facets to it, right? One is the private sector, one is the public sector, and the third one is the community. So you just about heard about everything about community, but some part of community, what Krob and Adrian talked about. You heard Krob and Omkar talked about sort of the public sector of it as well. But maybe on the private sector, I mean, I work for Intel. My day job is Intel, right? Intel is, there was a Forbes survey that came out, is the most cyber secure company. As we are shipping our products to customers, we want to make sure they are the most secure products. And as we are building software on top of that, as we're doing open source, we want to make sure they are open source, but secure as well. So that's where we are adapting tools that are coming out of OpenSSF. Things like OpenSSF Scorecard, things like Sigstore, things like Salsa. We are taking those tools that are coming out of OpenSSF, adapting them in the company. And as we are applying them to our hundreds and thousands of repos internally and externally, the feedback we are learning is we are putting back into the community, because it's a global problem, requires a global collaboration. So that's the key part of it. And I think the part Omkar was talking about, UN, the United Nations, have created these Millennium Development Goals. They created them at the beginning of the century. They used to call them as MDGs. They're about no poverty, no hunger, no crime, racial inequality, climate policy, all of that. 17 of them. In 2015, they renamed as, it's not just for the millennium, it's for the sustainability of the human being. So now they call them as Sustainable Development Goals. And as over the last year or so, I've been working a lot more closely with the UN, essentially saying that, hey, when you are creating these SDGs, goals are great, but UN is also realizing strongly that this is a global problem, requires a global collaboration. And guess what? Open source is the best platform for that global, diverse, inclusive perspective. So that's where we've been working with them, kind of, and including them into our events so that we can solve those sustainable development goals. We can connect the open source community that we know of from our side and hopefully solve those problems. Security is a key element of all of those elements as well, because particularly when you are talking about SDGs, you are digging into a lot of PIIs because you're talking to the local communities. How does that jurisdiction of data work? How does that make sure that, when you're looking at the medical data to solve an SDG, when you're looking at the climate data, when you're looking at the racial injustice data, when you're looking at the crime records, there are certain security requirements around that. So I think security plays a very key role as we continue to work with UN, and I'm super excited. We are working with them very closely, bringing them to our events. OpenSSF is well known in the open source community, so we're bringing our community connection, private industry connection to the UN, and really doing, as Omkar said, secure open source for the public good.
So who can talk to me about, so we talked about the different sectors. We talked about the, I don't know what you call them, the three programs, I'll say, right? The education and the incident response and the repository security. Talk to me about how we operationalize this in terms of developers up to business, which I'm sure it touches all those three. You provide tools, you provide education, you're doing policy work and things like that. But how do, I'm certain this is a huge benefit for organizations who build stuff, right? So how do they embrace and ingest and consume and take full advantage of all the stuff you have, be it tools and processes and the way to speak to the board and the executive staff, whatever it is you have, that whole stack? Who can start?
So prior to coming to the OpenSSF, I'd spent about 25 years of my career doing software engineering in private industry. And the headline is open source is different. And for those of you that may have developed software, according to some kind of schedule with a business requirements document and a high-level design and a low-level design and unit testing and all that stuff, open source just doesn't work that way. And I'm not saying there's a consistent way that open source works, but the beauty of open source is in this heterogeneous nature of development. So the what we'd learn in private industry about there being this top-down plan really doesn't happen in open source. So I think the first thing to understand before deriving how business value can be acquired through using open source is to understand, respect, and honor the fact that it's developed completely differently, and that each individual project that you engage in is going to have a different rhythm, a different ethos, a different way in which it operates. The reason for this is, if we extend the analogy of this being a public good, it is like a natural resource. And what I mean by that is, if you're taking a hike, and Arun and Adrianne are very nature-oriented, Krob and myself find ourselves at the bottom of a glass of bourbon more often than nature. But
why either or? That's why.
Well, this is an and, right, Sean? So while you're going for a hike, if you come across a creek and you take a sip of water from the creek, it's on you, right? It's on you to ensure that you're consuming good, clean water. If, however, you're a large corporation and you're consuming lots of water and bottling it and selling it for a profit, not only does the onus come upon you to ensure that it is safe and secure, but also that you're consuming this in a sustainable manner. So the other thing that I'd encourage those that are deriving business value from open source to consider is, this is an ecosystem. If it is all consume, it runs out. And it runs out in the sense that it doesn't have adequate maintenance. We have maintainers that'll be burned out. We have things that won't be done. And from a engineering management perspective, open source is amazing, but it's also economically opaque. And what I mean by that is, if you as a developer choose to download a library that handles cryptographic functions, link to it, and make use of it, you've saved tons of time. I teach applied cryptography. Writing robust cryptographic libraries is hard, and you've benefited from that. But if you don't honor that, if you don't find a way to contribute back in a way that the maintainers for the project would like, that resource does not last forever. So I think that...
Do you have any examples of that? This is really interesting to me.
Well, 10 years ago, when I was on vacation in Hawaii, there was this little security incident called Heartbleed that resulted in a security defect in OpenSSL. And I'm purposely choosing an incident from long ago so I can hand off to Krob for a more recent incident. OpenSSL was essentially maintained by volunteers. There was a great rush to fix it, but OpenSSL was found on every internet-facing device on the planet. Now, as I mentioned, I was on vacation. My wife had forced me to keep my BlackBerry, as one did back then, in the safe in the hotel, so I was blissfully ignorant till we came back from the beach. But the rest of my friends that were still at work did not have such a great time. And we're now at the point that there's a better sustainable funding around OpenSSL, and there's a number of different forks that are focused on security, but it's not fixed. And Krob, maybe you can describe for the audience some of the recent issues that we found with XC.
Yeah, and it's an interesting space. As Omkhar mentioned, each project, each ecosystem functions a little differently. They have different accepted norms and how they behave and how they want to take work or how they don't want to take work. And it's been a recent trend. And I think a bunch of us were at a CISA meeting where we were talking about open source and national security. And I think they threw out a figure that the global economy has received between $6 and $8 trillion of value out of open source. So, we went from open source being the purview and domain of a handful of people, mainly academics, some people, that used to be called hobbyists, but these are people that just loved writing software, and it's swung into this thing that drives the whole global economy. And we haven't necessarily applied all of the same discipline and rigor to our consumption like we should have. You only need to eat a little bit. You don't need to eat all of it. And as Omkhar mentioned, there was a package called XZ Utilities, which is embedded in most Linux distributions. Most open source programs had touched on it somehow, and it's a compression library, so it helped make files smaller for transferring things around. And it was a single maintainer that ran this thing, and that's not an uncommon story. Where actually, on the order of magnitude, there are probably dozens of projects that have hundreds of developers that work on them. There are an order of magnitude of hundreds of projects that might have 2 to 50, 100 maybe. And then the vast majority, 16 to 20 million other projects are a single maintainer. And that's what this XZ Utilities project was. Single maintainer, doing their best. They love the software. They're in it for, not out for financial motivation, but they're just in it because of the love of development and, adding value. And there's just so much of a backlog of work, so many large corporations or individual people asking them to continually, will you make this fix? Will you change this? All things that the maintainer, Lassie, didn't necessarily want to do, but just trying to offer good service to their community, trying to keep up with it. Well, it just became too much. And eventually there were some bad people, some nation state actors realized this is a pattern in open source where you'll have these overworked maintainers. And within the foundation, we like to refer to them as, we have a persona, Diana, the weekend warrior. And, this is a person that works maybe 4 hours a month on the software, and they spend most of their time fixing their build tools and trying to fix their dependencies to keep their project working, and not necessarily adding features, adding new functions, or, developing security fixes. Well, the backlog of work was so much that this maintainer, it was basically just so overworked, so stressed, that this bad actor came in and was able to subtly at first start to make contributions to the project, kind of earned a little bit of trust. And then through some social engineering, some other people in the community who have no evidence of existing before these commits started harassing the developer. I think you need to approve this person's commits. This fixes my problem. I want you must do this. You're a terrible person if you don't. And it really became kind of bullying. And the maintainer, Lassie, eventually agreed, accepted this unknown person who had almost a 2-year track record of tiny little contributions, and accepted them on as a maintainer and kind of gave them the keys to the project. And then the original maintainer just kind of stepped back a little bit, wasn't as involved daily, this person started to insert malicious software, manipulated the build pipeline. So eventually they put in a fairly substantial malicious package that was days away from being committed into major Linux distributions. But thankfully, just like open source, we had another community member that had taken these beta packages and was testing it for their own needs. And they noticed some weird utilization. Why is my CPU so high? And then they noticed some weird things with OpenSSL or OpenSSH, one of the two. But basically noticed some weird communication. They dug into it and they found out that there was a backdoor implanted in these beta things. And through the good work of a community person, they basically cracked this nation state attack that potentially could have affected every Linux distribution, which is most of the operating Linux on the planet. And then we found, Omkhar and I continue to work with CISA and other open source people upstream, where we're finding this wasn't an isolated pattern. This has happened at least once more. We have evidence of, and possibly more. So it's the same pattern where there's an overworked maintainer. This nice person offers to help, eventually is trying to get in and become a maintainer and own the project, and then they want to go start doing badness.
Crow, the one thing that I will add is it's a true testament to the strength of our community that most of the other incidents that we've seen, modulo the XZ Utils one, the community stepped up. Yep. And in the words of the New York MTA, they saw something and they said something like, hey, this was weird.
Yeah.
And we got all these reports coming in like, hey, we saw this, so many months back. We saw this a couple years ago, thought it was weird, didn't think anything of it. So I think that's a real testament to the strength of the community and how circumspect they are of new people trying to come in and intrude.
And you think about it, nation states invest millions of dollars for these type of zero-day attacks, and it was burnt like that. So they're not able to use that attack path. So, yay, open source. But we got to remain vigilant.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize the part that Crow was talking about. Frank Nagel, he's an assistant professor at Harvard. He wrote that paper about the supply side and the demand side of open source. Mm-hmm. And he talks about that how the supply side, basically the people who are creating open source, is about $4 billion. And on the demand side, people who are using open source is about $9 trillion. So when you think about all these companies that are relying upon open source and these kind of engineering attacks, and this is, by the way, less of an engineering attack, more of a human social engineering attack, and these are going to be a lot more prominent. So that's why the role of OpenSSF, raising education, raising awareness, raising the importance of this is so much more important. And that's why, frankly, when at Intel, when we look at that, hey, what level we should stay engaged at in OpenSSF, you could become a member at different levels. It's very clear in our mind that, no, we want to stay engaged at the governing board level because we believe this is not just Intel problem, this is an industry problem. And we want to be able to help influence, steer the direction so that we can be true to our customers. I think that's the way you want to think about it, the relevance and the importance and the critical importance of this foundation.
Tell me about the memberships, because that sounds like the key here, right? So vetted folks participating, giving back to the community, supporting the community, trust being at the center of it, I would imagine. Tell me a little bit more about that.
I'll start at the grassroots level, and then we can work our way up. Much like any open source project, participation is open to anyone. So we don't vet identity at like a technical initiative level. So you do need to prove yourself if you have to show a certain history and contributions and participation before you're granted additional privileges within the projects. But we're open to everybody. So the working groups I participate in, I have people from large corporations, I have academics, I have security researchers, I just have maintainers. I have Greg KH from the Linux kernel shows up to my working groups just because. So I have we have actual developers. So it's a really interesting mix of folks. And so again, it's open to anybody. But depending on what you're working on, like if it's one of our software projects like SigStore or Scorecard, there definitely is a not a hazing, but a vetting process that you have to go through. You have to prove that you're a valid known contributor and that you're adding value. You're just not some joker that says, I want the screen to be blue, not green.
Well, that process in open source is called as meritocracy. So, I mean, that's what it's got to be, right?
Yeah. Yep, exactly.
The one point that I wanted to double click on that Krob had mentioned, the open source community began online and it exists and thrives online. And often in the offline world where you go to work and you tap a badge on a reader and you go and sit down at your workstation, part of that is vetting or tying who you are from the get-go before you even write a line of code. The open source community does not regard your government identity as a security property. And I agree with that. The perspective that you can be completely online anonymous and write good code is something that's been proven consistent and something that works well. The fact that you could be identifiable by a passport and write bad code is also a proven fact. And when we start looking at more sophisticated attacks, such as the XCUtils one, people often clamor to, we need to better vet the identity of our community. If you follow the thread that this was probably a nation state actor, nation states are really good at issuing passports. So I don't want to fill anyone with false hope. But to Arun's point, the meritocracy is your code stands on its own. There's an even bar for security. Either it's secure or it's not. You don't get a buy because you're Greg KH or Krob. Your code needs to be vetted. So
you don't want my code.
We'll take Greg's though.
All right, we're coming up toward the end here, and I want to make sure we give folks a little extra so they know what to do next. Where should folks start? So I'm gonna first point out, give back. If you're eating, pay the restaurant, right? And maybe wash the dishes. If you don't have the cash, wash the dishes at the restaurant. Give back to the community. Consider becoming a member. Beyond that, what should folks do? Maybe the first step. Adrianne, I'm going to go to you to start this. Where should they go first?
The easiest way to get started is to go to openssf.org and go to the Get Involved page, where you will see a slew of information. See how to follow us on all the social media, how to join our Slack. You'll see the community calendar that shows all of the different meetings that happen for the technical initiatives throughout the weeks. And then too, I want to go back to what you said about doing the dishes. As someone who works a lot with the community, being a member is obviously fantastic. That helps get the practices happening at the higher level in enterprises. But if those enterprises can also get their OSPOs going, get developers involved to make sure we have people who are more than flyby contributors to be able to really set roots into projects, I think that goes a really long way. So that's my call to action. I think every time I have the chance to speak. So yeah, go to openssf.org/get involved and come join us on Slack and see where you can jump in to find something you like.
Nice. Crow.
Keying off of what Adrianne said, off of that page, you'll find a list of our 10 current working groups. These are our technical initiatives, and they're just rough categories of things we do, areas of the cyber and open source where we're collaborating. And we have things like developer best practices. We have a new AI and ML security group where they're looking at applying traditional application security practices to AI. I know it's a revolutionary thought. But we have things like we have dashboards. We have a whole metrics and metadata group where they're looking and analyzing different aspects of projects. We have a whole software repositories group. So if you care about things like Maven or Crates or any of the big repos, that's where you can kind of go and participate. We have a whole group dedicated towards writing and maintaining tools. So we have a lot of SBOM adjacent things lately, which is great. We have a DE&I group, which is looking to try to solve the problem of Omkhar and Arun and Krob retiring someday. I want to make sure that we have a great next generation of folks trained and they're ready to kind of carry the water for us, so to speak, after I'm too tired to move on. We have a supply chain integrity group that focuses in on things like SALSA, which is our supply chain levels of attestation or software levels of secure attestation. So basically it's a supply chain certification. So you can look at that and see anyone that has earned this, that you can understand how they are building and how their software is stored. We have a whole group focused towards end users. That's one of the groups I sponsor where I help kind of coach them. And that's banks and manufacturers, people that use open source, and they come and they collectively share, hey, how do I do this? Or how can you help? It's like a big support group. It's amazing. I love it. And then we have the vulnerability disclosure working group, which is another one that I help run. And we're looking at things like incident response, tools like Vex, it's a new way of sharing vulnerable information. We have some new excitement come on the horizon that Omkhar is going to unleash on the world in a couple of weeks. And that's where we talk about, how do we get good, accurate vulnerability information out to the world through tools like OSV and OpenVex.
Amazing. I'm sure you could keep going. Which is incredible.
I'm just humbled to work with such a great group of folks.
It's fantastic. Arun?
Yeah, I think sometimes as a security people, we dig too deep into the technology part of it. I would say, take a look at the Get Involved page. Pick one thing, don't get overwhelmed by it. Pick one thing that matters to you, that ignites your passion. Just start with that. That's a good starting point. Slack is a great place where you can hang out, where you can be completely silent. Just observe the dynamics and what the discussions are going like, who the players are. Try to understand sort of the dynamics of the community. And then whoever you feel comfortable with, reach out to them. We are a very friendly bunch. We are a very inclusive bunch. That's something that we hold ourselves to a very high degree. So just reach out to us on what would you like to contribute? What excites you? Where are you going to have fun? There are so many areas where we can leverage your help. Just reach out.
And I saved the hard cleanup spot for you, Omkar.
Thanks. So I'm going to say something unique and say go to openssf.org/get involved. I'm sure you haven't heard that yet. Right. I'll take a step back. Genuinely, and I was explaining this to somebody that I was speaking to yesterday. When we talk about different missions that we have and the different work that we get to do, if we get this right, we genuinely, without hyperbole, make the world better for 8 billion people. And if that's not inspiring, I don't know what is. So go to openssf.org/get involved. Check out all the work we're doing. This is not just a group of nerdy software engineers. Yes, there are nerdy software engineers there. But it's a place where anybody can help. We need people to help with documentation. We need people to help with hosting events. We need people to help with education. We just need people. So don't think that because you didn't get an undergrad in comp sci from a A-list school. Hey, I never finished my undergrad. So don't feel like that's an imposition. We just need people that are interested in helping the cause. So come one, come all. And we look forward to seeing you at OpenSSF.
Do it. Do it. I'm so grateful for each of you for the work you're doing. I'm glad this organization exists. And I really hope people listening to this first share it with somebody, multiple people, and then go to the Get Involved page.
Thanks so much for having us,
I think
Sean.
I've heard that. So thank you all. Really appreciate it. And everybody listening and watching, please do get involved and be sure to stay tuned to Redefining Cybersecurity as we all help to do just that, redefine cybersecurity for the benefit of society. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.